Chapters for our third exam on chapters 7, 8, and 9. Very interesting organization, political parties. There's some of you taking this class that would think our government would operate in a better fashion if we didn't have political parties. But as you read through this chapter, I think you can get the sense from the authors that you just can't have modern democracy, certainly in a country this size, without political parties. So let's explore how political parties are used in our system of government. I'm not going to read this out here to you, so you might want to pause this or at least turn to page 327 in your text, and you can see there the use of political parties and how they're important to our system. Now, unlike many democracies, in fact, most democracies, we're a two-party system. We really have two competitive political parties. Competitive meaning that they win elections and are able to field candidates on a very regular basis. We probably know about the iconography of the two parties, so the Democrat Party represented by the donkey and the elephant representing the Republican Party. So here you'll see, if you read through this chapter, there's some references to this political scientist, E.E. Schatzsnyder. Political parties created democracy, and modern democracy is unthinkable save in the terms of the parties. So from his perspective, it's extremely important to have political parties. And so here's your definition of political parties. Make a note of that. Read about that in the text. This is showing us the slate of candidates for the Republican Party for president in 2016, probably before the year 2016, actually. And we're probably looking at the summer of 2015 when you had this list of candidates that were running for president. A pretty big list of candidates there, as you can see. Very wide open field. Now, there are times, because of our two-party system and three branches of government, in which you have divided government. The last time we had divided government was when President Obama was in the White House, and you would have had then, at the end of 2016, you would have had a divided government, would have had a majority of the Republican Party in both houses and a Democrat president. That's when you have divided government. Sometimes you're able to get things done in that system of government, sometimes not. Depends on what particular goals you may have in the leadership and organization of the two major parties. But there are times in which we can clearly see that an opposition is necessary. Really, how does it work without a democracy or competitive system without having opposition? So when you see the attempt to reduce opposition and to maintain so much order that you really don't have competition, you have a military coup d'etat, as it's referred to, an overthrow of the government, a dictatorship, a single-party system, then oftentimes what will happen is that parties, opposing parties, are arrested, rounded up, sent out of the country perhaps, and even killed. So we can see there that if parties didn't matter, then there wouldn't be that type of extreme response to political parties when oligarchies or autocracies try to take over. And so one of the better known examples of a single party system that did not allow for opposition would be the National Socialist Party of Germany, known as the Nazi Party. You can see there on July 14th, 1933, that party outlawed all other political parties in Germany. So to be a member of a different political party at that time would have been violating the law. So again, we see that question of the need to have opposition political parties. Parties serve our system. Well, they recruit candidates, try to find candidates to run for certain offices. Maybe in some parts of the country, one party is overwhelmingly dominant, and in that situation, it may be very difficult to find parties to be formed or candidates to step up and run against the majority party. And so there's where political parties can step in and try to find those candidates. So think about that on your own. Just maybe write out some notes, put some thoughts together. What would be the type of candidate that parties might be looking for in areas where they're needing to recruit people? Who would they go to? What type of traits would these candidates have that would find them to be attractive? So that's one role of political parties, to recruit candidates. Nominate candidates. You have a nomination process. The primaries are used in most states. So we've gone into some detail about the primaries, or we will go into that. We had here in the state of Oklahoma a primary just last week to pick candidates for both major parties. Lots of different races for governor, for Congress, on down the list. Some states might use the caucus system, as you can see there. If you use a caucus, a state like Minnesota uses that, for example. You have to show up at a set time and you have to publicly announce. Almost always you're going to have less of a turnout if you use this system. And for the primary, you have states that use the open primary, and then you have states that use the closed primary. Or you can be a state like Oklahoma where one political party, the Democrats, has the open primary. You can be a registered Democrat or independent. And the Republican Party in the state has a closed primary. Only registered party members can participate. This gives us an idea here of when the main events of the nomination process took place in 2016 for both the Republican Party and Democratic Party at the presidential level. And notice here in bold print you have Super Tuesday. That was a key event. A lot of states on the ballot there. As you can notice, 12 states, including Oklahoma, were on the ballot that day. So that's a major event in the nomination process. Now, within the two political parties and the nomination process, you have differences on how to determine the delegates. In many of the elections in state-by-state process, depending on when they occur in the calendar year and which political party, you may have the winner-take-all. So if you finish first place in a state that has that, then you're going to get all delegates as a candidate. So you can see here that you can have an extremely close race, and it's beneficial only for the one who crosses the finish line first. So let's say you have three candidates and it's really evenly divided, and the one that got 34% as opposed to 33% gets them all. And so that system really narrows down the candidates pretty quickly and can wrap up the system pretty quickly too. Proportionality tends to keep candidates that are not necessarily winning in the race. And that's the difference that you can see there between winner-take-all and proportionality. And we can see that difference here by roughly a month. The Republicans had more of the winner-take-all system, and that meant Trump got to be the nominee in a quicker fashion for the Republican Party. And Clinton, even though if we know, Clinton really had one major opponent, Bernie Sanders, throughout the race, where Trump had many different opponents, actually may have worked to his advantage in a winner-take-all system, that he didn't have to get a large percentage of the vote, but he would still win the state's primary. So for Clinton, as you can see there, it lasted over a month longer to get the nomination, and a lot of that had to do with the proportional representation system. Bernie didn't have to win. In fact, he lost most of the state primaries, but that was able to keep him in the race by having a proportional system. So there's just the way the structure of the race works in Oklahoma, the primary works. How do parties serve the system? So we recruit candidates, nominate candidates, mobilize voters, get people out to vote. How do you get them out to vote? One of the most effective way is to personally ask people to go vote. That takes a lot more. It's more labor intensive to do that. It's more involved, and so you have to have more volunteers to get that to happen. And then again, if you only had one person on the ballot, you would not have a contested election. So you have to have at least 2 people on the ballot. So that's one of the key signs of a dictatorship. If they have elections but only one person on the ballot, it's not a contested election. Fidel Castro from Cuba was very infamous in that he would have periodic elections in Cuba, but he was the only one on the ballot. Accountability. Think about where we're going in the midterm elections, where you have the Republican Party at its highest level of dominance since the 1920s in America. And so we have a one-party rule in our Congress and president, the national level, and throughout most states actually as well. So if you like the way things are going, then you have one party to turn to and reward. If you don't like the way things are going, in most areas, you have one political party to turn to and punish. And so that's where accountability becomes clearer if you have one party in charge. See this in political parties today, but there was a time in which political parties would serve as providing forms of social services, food, jobs, clothing, places to stay, those kinds of services. And that by and large has died out. And really since about the 1930s is the last time you would see a community, a state, or primarily cities that would provide that kind of service. Richard Daley, that's the man's picture that you see there on the left. He was mayor of Chicago up until the 1970s. And in Chicago, there was still a way in which the party machine, and he was the boss of that machine, the local Democratic Party in Chicago would provide those types of social services. Some of this is brought to life in the movie Gangs of New York, which is very historically relevant in terms of events that happened there in New York, roughly in the Civil War era. And certainly political parties, the Democratic Party primarily in New York City, would provide social services for people. There are third parties. A lot of those third parties are not very successful, but they're at least on the ballot and competitive. And so they're not competitive in the sense that they're getting votes. They're not really competitive when it comes to winning elections. So some examples of third parties. The Green Party, primarily focused on environmental issues. Probably the best known of our third parties, the Libertarian Party, been around, as you can see there, since 1971. Party that wants to reduce the overall scope of government in people's lives. The Libertarian Party's candidate for president, he was a former governor, Republican governor of New Mexico, Gary Johnson. But third parties tend to not have much success in the United States. Why is that? Here's some of the reasons for that. They're too dependent on a single leader. So when Perot got out of politics, his party pretty much collapsed, the People for the American Way. They're too regional. Populist Party, for example, which this cartoon is depicting, focusing on issues such as what type of ore, gold or silver, should back paper money, and they wanted silver to back paper money, not just gold. That was an important issue in the South and the West, but not throughout the whole country. So they're focused on particular regions. Too fixated on particular issues. Light wine and beer party, very small third party, didn't have a lot of success, but tried to provide some form of a political wedge on the prohibition issue. And then it can just be too radical. Hopefully, enough people in the United States will continue to view the National Socialist and the Communist parties as too radical. I think it would be in the best interest of all of us, if that continued. Probably the voting structure has more to do with why it's very difficult for third parties to compete than anything else. One winner per district, and all you need is a plurality. Don't need a majority of the vote. And so, as we've mentioned in some other cases, Duverger's law, observation here about politics in countries that have that system, you tend to have only two competitive political parties. If you add in also the Electoral College, it really seems to seal the deal that there's only two competitive political parties. Court cases dealing with political parties, you can't have a case in which you only let white people vote in a primary. It's not a private club. You have to allow other people to do so, and that would certainly violate the 14th Amendment today, but it was ruled to be unconstitutional even in 1944. You also can't reward people jobs based on their affiliation with a political party, government jobs. And so that's also a ruling against a particular political party. If you did go with proportional representation, there's a greater likelihood that you're going to have more than two political parties represented. As you can see here, a party is represented based on its proportion of the overall vote. You get 30% of the vote, you get 30% of the representation, and on down the line. You get 70% of the vote, you get 70% of the representation. More than likely, there's going to be more than two political parties on the ballot, and that will then mean that political parties aren't going to get 70% of the vote. One political party not going to do that. And so here's a fairly recent example. There's been a national election in Germany since this one, but here you can see some competitiveness. 5 political parties got representation in the system there in Germany. But if you can also notice, no one political party got a majority of the vote as well. This means that Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, would need to work. She's from the party that got the most votes, the Christian Democrats, but she would then need to work with other political parties to form a coalition to keep her in a position of authority. So she can only be elected chancellor if her party and other coalition partners have enough votes in the Bundestag to get her elected. So that's like the people's house. And that's how she would be able to be in a position to be like the prime minister. It's called the chancellor in the German system. So that's the way that you see with proportional representation. It can be both good and bad. It does tend to increase voting turnout, and it tends to give more political parties a chance to win, but it also means that it's less likely in which one political party would have a majority. In the German system, you have one vote to vote for a candidate, which would be a first past the post type of system, and then the other one where you would vote for the party, which would be proportional representation. So here you can see some of the contrast. You have a really good chart that shows you some of that. And one of the things that you can clearly see with our system is it can distort votes and you can end up with more representation than what would really serve with the voting public for a political party. So you can see there in 2014 how, based on how the districts were drawn, the Republicans got more votes, more representation than what their votes would deserve. And I think a really big question, though, is we can see going into this midterm election, will we start to see a new party system emerge? Will there be, and this more than likely, of the two political parties as they are right now, are we ushering in an era in which Republicans will be the dominant party, or will there be a way of balancing that out and going into, once again, where we have been for the most part, an era of divided party government, where you have one party in charge of Congress, one party in charge of the presidency. So there's a lot to see about what's happening this November in 2018.